Eleanor Whitaker slammed her hands flat on the kitchen work table and looked the foreman dead in the eye. "Fire me," she said. "Go ahead and do it. Say what every man in this room is already thinking. Say I'm too big, too worn out, too much trouble. Say I don't belong in your kitchen." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't drop. "But you'll say it to my face, not behind my back, not through whispers, not through boys too cowardly to speak it out loud. You want me gone, you'll have to tell me yourself." Nobody moved. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart, please hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to this channel. Now let's get back to Eleanor, because what happened next in that kitchen is something nobody on Broken River Ranch ever forgot. The foreman's name was Walter Briggs, and in 22 years of running cattle operations across 3 Montana counties, he had never once been spoken to like that by a cook. Certainly not by a woman. Certainly not by a woman who had just stepped off a wagon 40 minutes ago with a single leather suitcase road dust on her dress and not one single letter of formal recommendation in her hand. Walter stood there with his jaw tight and his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he looked at Eleanor Whitaker, the way men like him had always looked at women like her, like she was a problem that had shown up uninvited on a day that already had too many problems. The kitchen behind her was a disaster. Anyone with eyes could see it. The stove had a cracked pipe. 3 of the supply barrels were tipped sideways and half empty. There was a smell in that room that told a story of months of bad management, indifferent cooking, and men who had simply stopped caring what they put in their mouths because nobody around them cared either. Eleanor had taken all of that in within 30 seconds of walking through the door. She had also taken in the 7 ranch hands who were leaning in the doorframe and along the back wall, arms crossed, watching her with the lazy amusement of men who had already decided she wasn't serious. She'd seen that look her entire life. She was used to it. She was not, however, willing to let it win. "Ma'am," Walter said, finally. His voice dropping low the way men did when they were trying to sound patient and reasonable, while being neither. "I don't know what you were told in town, but this ranch isn't a boarding house. It isn't a church social. These are working men. 30 of them. They wake before dawn, they work until dark, and they eat like they work hard and fast and without complaint." "Good," Eleanor said. Walter blinked. "Good. That means they're hungry. Hungry men appreciate a real meal." She looked around the kitchen with a steady eye. "Which means they haven't had one in a while by the looks of things." One of the ranch hands in the doorway made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something meaner. Eleanor didn't look at him. "Mrs. Whitaker," Walter started. "Miss," she corrected. "Miss Whitaker." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I placed that notice in town because I needed a cook. I was expecting someone else," she said. "Someone with experience running a large kitchen operation." "I ran the kitchen at the Harmon Hotel in Billings for 4 years, Eleanor said. 60 guests a day, sometimes more during cattleman's season. I managed supplies, I managed staff, and I managed men, twice your size, who thought they knew better than me about how to feed a crowd." She paused. "I am experienced." "That's not what I—" Walter stopped himself. "I know what you mean," Eleanor said quietly. "And I'm choosing not to take offense at it. Not today. I've got too much work ahead of me to spend my energy on what you think when you look at me." The kitchen was silent. Walter Briggs, to his credit, was not an entirely stupid man. He recognized something in Eleanor's voice that he hadn't expected. Not desperation, not pleading, not the trembling quality of a woman who needed this job badly enough to absorb anything he threw at her. He recognized competence. It had a sound to it, a steadiness, and it was the same sound in every person he'd ever hired who turned out to be worth the trouble. He just hadn't expected to hear it coming from a woman who looked like her. And that, though he would never say it out loud, was the thing that made him hesitate, instead of sending her back to town on the next wagon. 3 days, he said finally. Eleanor's chin lifted a 1/4 inch. 3 days. You cook 3 days' worth of meals. I see what you can do with what we've got. If the men are eating well, and the kitchen's running clean, we talk about terms. He held her gaze. You fall short. I put you back on a wagon myself, and you go back to wherever you came from. No hard feelings, no debt, no discussion." "Understood," Eleanor said. "And Miss Whitaker." Walter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I want to be straight with you. Some of these men aren't going to make this easy." "Mr. Briggs," Eleanor said, "none of it has ever been easy." She turned toward the stove before he could respond, and the conversation was over. What Walter Briggs did not know, what nobody on Broken River Ranch knew, yet was the full weight of what Eleanor was carrying into that kitchen with her. She had not come from Billings. She had not left the Harmon Hotel on her own terms. She had been let go, not for any failure of work, not for any complaint from a guest, not for anything she had done wrong in 4 years of honest, tireless labor. She had been let go because the owner's wife had come into the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. In March had looked at Eleanor with an expression that communicated everything without saying a word, and had said to her husband that evening that the hotel's image required a certain kind of presentation, even in the staff, and that the kitchen girl was not the right sort of figure for a respectable establishment. Eleanor had been handed a week's wages, and a handshake, and a thank you for your service, and she had walked out into the cold Montana street with her suitcase and her silence, and the particular kind of humiliation that comes from being told very politely that your body is a problem. She had been 23 years old then. She was 27 now, and in the 4 years between that Tuesday in March and this afternoon at Broken River Ranch, she had learned things about herself and about the world that no comfortable life would have taught her. She had learned that she could sleep in a wagon when there was no money for a room. She had learned that pride was a luxury, and dignity was not that you could let go of one and hold the other without losing yourself. She had learned that there were towns where a woman of her size and her situation could find a day's work. Washing dishes or hauling supplies, in towns where she couldn't get a door open to her, no matter how clean her hands were or how steady her references. She had learned to read a room in the first 10 seconds and know whether she was going to get a fair hearing or whether she was performing for an audience that had already voted. She had also learned to cook in ways she never had before. Not hotel cooking controlled by ice, designed to impress. Out in the world, with limited supplies and uncertain kitchens, and men or women who ate because they needed fuel, and nothing else. She had learned to cook the way the land itself operated efficiently, without waste, with everything given its proper purpose. She was better than she'd been at the Harmon Hotel. She was better than anyone on Broken River Ranch was about to expect. The first thing she did was look at what she had. She moved through this kitchen with the quiet focus of a woman solving a puzzle she'd been given before, opening barrels and checking shelves and lifting pot lids and running her fingers along the inner wall of the stove to check the heat distribution. She didn't make notes. She kept the inventory in her head sorted and cataloged the way she'd trained herself to do when paper wasn't always available. What she had: dried beans, cornmeal, a side of salt pork that was borderline but salvageable, a sack of flour with weevils at the top. Third, that she could work around onions, a modest supply of lard, and a collection of dried herbs that someone with more optimism than skill had gathered and never properly used. What she didn't have: fresh anything. That was the first problem. The second problem was the stovepipe, which was cracked at the elbow joint and bleeding smoke into the kitchen instead of carrying it out. She could work around it, but not for long, and not without the fire she built being smaller than what she needed. She had already decided what she was making for supper when she heard the boots on the floorboards behind her. She didn't turn around. "Stovepipe's cracked," she said. "I know it." The voice was quiet, not the foreman's, not any of the voices she'd cataloged from the doorway. She turned then and found a man standing a few feet inside the kitchen door, turning his hat in his hands the way cowboys did when they were trying to communicate that they weren't a threat. How was lean brown from the sun, with lines around his eyes that had been put there by years of squinting into open sky. His clothes were worn and clean in the way that suggested someone who worked hard and kept himself as put together as honest labor allowed. He was looking at the stovepipe with the focused expression of a man who was already thinking about how to fix it, rather than describing the problem. "I can fix it," he said. "I've got a sleeve fitting in the barn that'll seal that joint. Take me 20 minutes. Eleanor looked at him. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her. "Because it needs fixing." "You're a ranch hand," she said. Yes, ma'am. That's not your job. He shrugged easy and unhurried. Ranch is in better shape when things work. Never saw much sense in dividing up what needs doing by job title. He glanced at the pipe again. You can't cook right with that bleed. Fire'll be too low, and the kitchen'll fill with smoke before supper. Eleanor studied him for a moment. There was nothing in his manner that asked for anything in return. No performance of helpfulness designed to earn something. Just a man who had identified a problem and was offering to solve it. 20 minutes, she said. Or less, he said. What's your name? She asked. Samuel, he said. Samuel Caldwell. Miss Whitaker, she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, and walked back out toward the barn. She watched him go, then turned back to the stove. She had beans to start soaking. Samuel Caldwell was back in 18 minutes with the fitting and the tools, and he worked on the pipe with the kind of quiet efficiency that Eleanor recognized as the mark of someone who had done physical problem-solving long enough that it was simply part of the way he moved through the world. He didn't talk while he worked, which she appreciated. She had encountered the other kind men who filled silence with their own voices, as though quiet made them nervous, and she found them exhausting. She worked while he worked, and the kitchen filled with the sound of two people solving different problems in the same room, and there was something unexpectedly comfortable about it. When he was done, he said, "That'll hold." "Thank you," Eleanor said. He nodded, collected his tools, and left. She did not think about him again for the rest of the afternoon. She was too busy. By the time the sun started dropping toward the western ridge, Eleanor had a pot of beans that had been slowly becoming something with the salt pork and the onions, and half those dried herbs that turned out to be perfectly good thyme and bay once she sorted the quality from the waste. She had cornbread in the oven in a cast-iron pan. She had coffee that was not the scorched bitter punishment she'd tasted from the pot someone had left on the back of the stove, because she had dumped that pot, cleaned the metal, and started over with the same beans ground fresh, and a ratio that did not punish the person drinking it. It wasn't a grand meal. It was not hotel food. It was honest. It was hot. And it was made with the full force of her attention and capability. The first cowboys came in at dusk, loud and tired and smelling of cattle and dust, and they stopped when they hit the smell coming from that kitchen. Eleanor stood at the stove and did not look up. She heard the change in the room, the way the voices dropped, the way boots shuffled, the way the youngest ones looked at each other and back toward the pots with an expression she knew well. Hunger recognizing that it was about to be met. "Go on and sit down," she said without turning. "It's ready." There were some mutters. There was some of the expected commentary kept low, not meant for her ears, but not kept low enough. She had learned not to hear those particular words, the ones about her size, the ones about women in working kitchens, the ones that were designed not to wound, but to establish a hierarchy that kept the speaker comfortable and the subject small. She served them anyway. Big portions. Hot food. No ceremony, no performance. She moved around that table the way she moved around a kitchen with purpose without waste, covering ground efficiently, and making sure every man at the table had what he needed. The youngest one couldn't have been more than 16, with a gap in his front teeth, and ears, still too big for his face, looked up at her when she set the plate in front of him and said, "Ma'am, this smells like my grandmother's kitchen." Eleanor looked at him. "What's your name?" "Tommy Reed, ma'am." "You eat well, Tommy Reed," she said. He ate 3 portions. The other men ate well too, though most of them weren't willing to say so directly. Some of them went quiet in the way that meant they were actually tasting something instead of just fueling themselves. One old hand named Pete Garfield, who had a gray beard to his collarbone and had spent enough years on ranches to have developed strong opinions about camp cooking, put his fork down at the end of the meal and looked at the empty plate in front of him with an expression Eleanor had learned to read. Respect. The grudging, reluctant kind. The kind that costs the person feeling it something. He didn't say anything, but he didn't say anything bad either. And in Eleanor's experience from men like Pete Garfield, silence was a compliment. Samuel Caldwell sat at the far end of the table. He ate quietly the way he did everything, and he looked at his plate the same way he'd looked at the stovepipe, like he was paying attention to what it was telling him. When the meal was done and the table was emptying, He looked up and found Eleanor already back at the stove, starting on the cleanup, while the other men were still pulling on their coats. He picked up his plate, and the plate of the man next to him, and carried them to the wash basin. Eleanor looked at him. "Ranch hands don't usually clear plates," she said. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "Then why?" He considered the question. "Same reason as the stovepipe," he said. "It needed doing." He set the plates down and walked out. Eleanor stood in the kitchen after the last man had gone and listened to the sound of the fire settling in the stove, and the wind coming off the Montana flats, and the distant sound of cattle. And she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of feeling what the evening had cost her. It had cost her more than anyone in that dining room understood. Not physically, she was strong, built for the kind of sustained effort that a working kitchen demanded, but in the particular way that performing competence in front of people who were watching you fail always cost something. She had been observed all evening. Not just looked at, but watched the way people watch a tightrope walk, waiting to see whether the person falls. She had not fallen. But it was only the first night, and Walter Briggs had given her 3 days, and she understood that the men who had been quiet tonight might not stay quiet when it became clear she intended to keep showing up. She had been through this before. She was going to get through it again. She put the last clean pot on its shelf, banked the fire in the stove, and walked out of the kitchen into the Montana night with her back straight and her hands steady, and the quiet, determined knowledge that she was going to cook breakfast in the morning and that it was going to be better than supper. It was. She was up before dawn, had the fire built before any ranch hand stirred, and had biscuits in the oven, and a pan of thick-sliced salt pork going, and a pot of proper oatmeal. Not the gray wallpaper paste she'd found congealing on the back of the stove when she'd arrived by the time the first sleepy cowboys stumbled into the dining room with their eyes still half shut. Tommy Reed was the first one through the door, and the first one to stop dead in his tracks. "Is that?" he started. "Biscuits," Eleanor's confirmed. "Sit down before they cool." He sat down so fast the chair scraped loud on the floorboards. By the end of the second day, something had quietly shifted on Broken River Ranch, though nobody was naming it out loud. The men came to meals instead of dragging themselves to them. The dining room had conversation instead of just the sound of silverware and chewing. Pete Garfield had taken to arriving 5 minutes early and sitting in the same chair, which was in the unwritten language of working men. The behavior of someone who had developed an expectation of something worth showing up for. Tommy Reed had started finding reasons to be near the kitchen door in the afternoon. He wasn't bold enough to come in without being invited, but he stood near enough that Eleanor could hear him, and twice she'd seen him close his eyes when the bread smell hit him, the way a person does when something reaches into a closed-off part of them and finds it. She'd put a plate out for him on the kitchen step on the afternoon of the second day, without comment, and he'd eaten it in about 4 minutes flat, and left the plate carefully on the step and disappeared without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing to do. Walter Briggs watched all of this with the carefully controlled expression of a man revising his expectations, without wanting anyone to know he'd had to. Eleanor noticed. She noticed everything. She noticed that Samuel Caldwell had repaired the latch on the kitchen door on the morning of the second day, which had saved her from fighting with it every time she came through with both hands full. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't known he'd done it until it happened, until she walked through the door carrying a pot, and it opened cleanly instead of sticking. And she stopped and looked at the new latch, and then looked around and saw him at the far end of the yard, already walking toward the cattle pens, with no backward glance. She noticed that he asked no credit for anything he did. She noticed that he ate his meals without looking at her, in the way some of the other men did not. The hostile looking, not the assessing looking, but the kind of specific looking that turned into a woman, into a subject of discussion, rather than a person in a room. He looked at her the way he looked at the stovepipe and the door latch, like she was someone in a situation that had requirements, and the question he was asking himself was what those requirements were and whether he could help meet them. Without agenda. Without performance. It was, she thought, the most comfortable she had felt being looked at by a man in a very long time. On the morning of the third day, she made a decision. She walked into the supply room before breakfast and took full inventory. Not just of what was there, but of what the patterns of use told her about how the ranch had been managed. And what she found made her still for a long moment. The supplies were not just poorly managed. They had been actively mishandled. Barrel quantities that should have lasted 6 weeks had been burned through in 3. The accounts in the order ledger left open on a shelf, as though nobody thought anyone would look at it, showed purchase orders that didn't match the inventory she was looking at. Significant quantities of flour, sugar, coffee, and cured meat had been ordered and paid for, and were not in this room. Eleanor stood in that supply room and understood several things at once. First, whoever had been managing the ranch kitchen had been stealing from the operation. Second, if she reported this, there was every chance it would be used against her. Whoever had done it might easily redirect suspicion toward the new woman who'd appeared without warning and was already being watched for failure. Third, she was going to report it anyway, because it was the right thing to do, and because Eleanor Whitaker had made a decision a long time ago that she was not going to let fear of what might happen to her determine whether she did what was right. She went to find Walter Briggs. She found him near the horse barn, and she said, "Mr. Briggs, I need 5 minutes of your time, inside away from the yard." Walter looked at her face and said, "What's happened?" Not a question. He already heard something in her voice. She told him what she'd found. She laid it out plainly without drama, with the specific numbers and the specific discrepancies. The kind of accounting a woman who'd managed a hotel kitchen had learned to do automatically as part of protecting her own position. Walter listened without interrupting. His jaw was getting tighter with every number she gave him. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. "You sure about this?" he said. "I'm sure about what's in that room and what's in that ledger," Eleanor said. "Someone else will need to be sure about what it means. You know that by bringing this to me, you're—" Walter stopped. "I'm making myself a target," Eleanor said. "Yes, I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why bring it to me at all?" he said. "You could have looked the other way. Nobody would have known you'd seen it." "I'd have known," Eleanor said. Walter Briggs said nothing for another moment, and then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, low and without humor, and he said, "Miss Whitaker, I believe I am looking at someone who is going to be more trouble than I expected." "I expect so," Eleanor agreed. "And considerably more useful," he added, and something in his voice had changed. She noticed, but she didn't let herself feel too much about it, because she had learned the hard way that feeling too much too soon was a good way to get knocked back farther than you'd started. She had a third day's meals to prepare, and she went to prepare them. What she did not know as she walked back across that yard toward the kitchen was that Samuel Caldwell had seen the conversation from across the yard. Had seen the direction of it. Not the words, but the body language of it. Eleanor standing straight and serious. Walter listening with that jaw getting tight. The quality of the exchange that told a watching person. This was not a complaint or a problem, but a report. A woman bringing information and standing behind it. What she did not know was that Samuel Caldwell, standing in the shade of the barn entrance, with his hat brim low, was watching Eleanor Whitaker walk back to his kitchen and feeling something shift very quietly inside him. Not because she was a woman, and he was a man, and these were the expected feelings. Because he was the owner of Broken River Ranch, and for 6 months he had been riding and working alongside his own hired hands in the dust and the cold and the hard daily labor of the place, trying to understand what his ranch actually was when nobody thought anyone important was watching. Because he had inherited this land from his father, who had inherited it from his, and he had spent the first 5 years of ownership managing it from a distance in the way wealthy men did, and the ranch had not thrived. And now he was here in worn boots and a working man's clothes, looking at what he'd built, and mostly what he'd been seeing was a place that was running on survival instead of anything better. And then Eleanor Whitaker had arrived with her leather suitcase and her chin up, and in 3 days she had walked into his kitchen and put life back into it. Not just food, but something that a working place needed and didn't always have, which was the evidence that someone cared about the people in it. And now she had walked into his supply room and found what was wrong and gone to the foreman with the truth, knowing it might cost her because it was the right thing to do. Samuel Caldwell stood in the barn doorway and looked at the door of his kitchen closing behind Eleanor Whitaker, and he thought quietly and with certainty, this woman is exactly the kind of person this place has always needed. And then he went back to work. Because that was what you did. That was what Eleanor did. That was what all the honest people did every day on the land, and in the kitchens, and in the barns of the American West. They went back to work, and they kept going, and they carried what they carried with them, and they kept going anyway. Inside the kitchen, Eleanor put another log in the stove and started on supper. She was still here. She was still standing. And that she had learned was everything. The third supper was the best one yet. She had stretched her supplies with an ingenuity born of long practice, had coaxed the last of the salvageable flour into a proper gravy that she ladled over the salt pork, had used the bean pot that had been simmering since morning as a base that was by now deep and rich and warming in the way that reached down into tired muscles and loosened them. It was not elegant. Nobody would have called it fine dining. But Pete Garfield, who had not said one full positive sentence to Eleanor since her arrival, pushed his second empty plate back and looked up at her and said, "You can cook, woman. I'll say that much." It was coming from Pete Garfield, a speech. Tommy Reed, who by now had established himself as Eleanor's unofficial shadow during the afternoon hours, said, "It's the best supper I've had since I was home." "Where's home?" Eleanor asked. "Ohio," he said. "Long ways." "Long ways." Eleanor agreed. She had her back to the room while she said it, tending the stove, and she was quiet for a moment. And Tommy Reed was quiet. And in that quiet, there was a recognition between two people who both understood what it meant to be a long way from where they'd started. Walter Briggs came to her after supper while she was cleaning up. "3 days are up," he said. Eleanor waited. "Terms," he said, "starting with wages." She named a number. Walter opened his mouth. She looked at him. He closed his mouth. She named the number again. "Plus," she said, "supply management authority. What comes in and what goes out goes through me with accounting you can verify." Walter considered for a moment. "That's a considerable ask," he said. "After what I found in that ledger," Eleanor said, "it is a considerable problem. You want a problem solved, you hire someone to solve it." She paused. "Mr. Briggs, I am asking to do my job properly. That's all." Walter Briggs looked at Eleanor Whitaker for a long moment and said, "I'll need to clear this with the owner." "Of course," Eleanor said. She went back to scrubbing the pot. She did not know that the owner already knew. She did not know that Samuel Caldwell had stood in the yard that afternoon and watched everything unfold, and that he had already made his decision, and that the conversation Walter was planning to have with the ranch's owner would be the shortest conversation Walter Briggs had ever had in his professional life. She was just a cook, standing in a kitchen at the end of the third day, clean pot in her hands, Montana night outside the window, her position on Broken River Ranch, no more certain than it had been 72 hours ago. And she was still here, still standing, still not giving up, still not giving them what they'd been waiting for. Still Eleanor. Walter Briggs came back the next morning with an answer so fast that Eleanor almost missed the significance of it. She was standing at the stove when he walked through the kitchen door, and she had the sense of a man who had not slept well, not from worry, but from the particular restlessness of someone who had received news that rearranged what he thought he understood. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Terms accepted," he said. Eleanor turned from the stove slowly. "All of them. All of them." He held her gaze. "Supply management, accounting authority, wages as requested." He cleared his throat. The owner was specific about it. Eleanor set down the spoon in her hand and faced him fully. "That was fast." "Yes," Walter said. He seemed like a man who wanted to say more and had decided against it. "It was." She waited. He didn't add anything. "All right," Eleanor said. "All right." He agreed and walked out. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, looking at the door that had just swung shut. In her experience, things that moved that quickly either meant someone was very impressed or someone was very eager, and both of those possibilities had a way of creating complications. She wasn't prepared to navigate on an empty stomach. She went back to the stove. Whatever it meant she had the job, and she had work to do. The first thing she did with her new authority was sit down with the ledger. Not the sorry excuse for an account book that had been left open on the supply room shelf. She'd already studied that one thoroughly enough to know what it was hiding. She asked Walter for the full order history, every purchase made for the ranch kitchen in the previous 8 months, and she took it to the kitchen table after supper on a Tuesday night and worked through it by lantern light with the methodical attention of a woman who had learned that the numbers always told a story if you asked them the right questions. What the numbers told her was worse than she'd suspected. It wasn't disorganized management. It wasn't even straightforward theft, though theft was certainly part of it. What the numbers told her was a pattern, systematic, deliberate, and designed to be difficult to catch, without a comparison between what was ordered, what was paid for, and what was actually in the supply room at any given time. Someone had been running a parallel operation, taking ranch funds to purchase goods that appeared in the ledger but never appeared in the kitchen. They'd been doing it for at least 7 months, possibly longer. Eleanor wrote down every discrepancy on a separate sheet of paper, organized by date and by amount, with the specific entries in the ledger beside each one. It took her until nearly midnight. When she was done, she looked at what she'd written and felt the particular cold clarity that came when something you'd suspected turned out to be fully verifiably true. She folded the sheet of paper and put it in her apron pocket. She was going to need to have another conversation with Walter Briggs. But not tonight. Tonight, she was going to get 4 hours of sleep because the biscuits needed to be started before dawn, and she was not going to let the ranch's breakfast suffer because of someone else's dishonesty. She banked the fire, turned down the lantern, and went to bed. She was up at 4:15. It was Tommy Reed who noticed the change first, not in the food, which had been consistently excellent since Eleanor's first night, but in Eleanor herself. He came to the kitchen door on Wednesday afternoon, the way he'd taken to doing, drawn there by a force he couldn't have named out loud without embarrassing himself, and found her not cooking, but writing her pen, moving across paper with a speed and focus that he associated with people who were working out a problem that had teeth. He stood in the doorway long enough that she heard him. "Come in, or don't, Tommy," she said without looking up. He came in. He sat on the stool near the back wall that had become unofficially his over the past week. "You all right, Miss Whitaker?" "I'm fine." She kept writing. "You've got your problem face on," he said. Eleanor's pen stopped. She looked up at him. "My what?" Tommy reddened, but he didn't back down. He was more courageous than he looked, this boy, which Eleanor had noted as a quality worth paying attention to. "My grandmother used to get that face," he said, "when she found something wrong that she was about to make right. Kind of quiet and sort of dangerous." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "You're a perceptive young man, Tommy Reed," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My grandmother always said so, too." She went back to her writing, and Tommy sat on his stool and ate the apple she pushed toward him without being asked to. And outside the kitchen, the ranch went about its afternoon business. And inside the kitchen, a woman built her case with the same precision she brought to everything else. She brought it to Walter Briggs the next morning. She walked into his office, a small, cluttered room off the main barn that smelled of tobacco and horse liniment, and laid the paper on his desk and stood back and let him read it. He read it twice. "How long did this take you?" he said. "An evening," Eleanor said. He looked up. "And you're sure?" "The numbers are the numbers," Eleanor said. "They don't argue." Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, which was what men did. Eleanor had noticed when they were trying to contain a reaction that they didn't want to show. He was quiet for a long time. "I need to bring this to the owner," he said finally. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "There are going to be complications." He chose the word carefully. "I expect so." "The man who managed the kitchen before you." Walter stopped. "I don't need to know his name," Eleanor said. "What happens next isn't my business. Presenting the evidence was." Walter looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize as his version of being impressed by something he hadn't been ready to be impressed by. "Most people in your position would be worried about the blowback," he said. "Most people in my position spend so much time worried about blowback that they never do anything worth doing," Eleanor said. "I am not most people." She walked out. She had cornbread batter to start. What followed was 3 days of the kind of tension that lives in the walls of a place rather than in the open air. The kind that working men feel in their chests without knowing exactly why. That makes conversations shorter and boot steps heavier and the space around the dining table slightly too charged for comfort. Eleanor understood what was happening even without the details. Walter was investigating. Questions were being asked. Someone on this ranch was becoming aware that the new cook had arrived, dug through the ledger, and handed a lit match to the foreman. She kept cooking. She did not involve herself in what she couldn't control. She managed her kitchen with the same quiet authority she'd brought to it from the first night, and she went about her days with an evenness of manner that she had learned at considerable personal cost was the most powerful thing a woman in her situation could project. But she felt it. She felt the weight of eyes that had shifted from skeptical to something more complicated. Some of the men looked at her differently now, with a respect that was not yet comfortable with itself, the kind that sits sideways in a man who wasn't expecting to feel it. Others looked at her with something cooler, something that was measuring. She noticed on Thursday afternoon that a man she didn't know well, a ranch hand named Clayton Brooks who rode with the cattle crew and had a habit of being just slightly louder than the room required, had stopped coming in for the afternoon coffee she'd taken to keeping warm on the back of the stove. She noticed because Tommy Reed had mentioned Clayton once in passing, as someone who'd made a comment about the new cook that Tommy had found worth repeating, and then had immediately decided not to repeat it after all his ears going red. Eleanor had not pursued it. She noted it the way she noted everything, and she filed it away. Clayton Brooks came back to supper on Thursday night the same as always, and she served him the same as always, and he ate in the same silence as always, and nothing was said. But when she went back to the kitchen after clearing, she stood at the wash basin and felt for the first time since she'd been given the terms of her employment, the familiar crawling cold at the back of her neck that told her she had made an enemy she hadn't fully identified yet. She washed her hands and dried them and went to bed. Friday morning, Walter came to the kitchen before breakfast. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I need to tell you something." "Go ahead," she said. She was at the stove. "The man who managed the supplies before you was let go last night. Quietly. He's gone." Walter paused. "You should know he's got friends on this ranch, men who rode with him a long time." Eleanor kept her hands moving. Did he deserve to be let go? Without question. "Then it's done," she said. "It's not quite that simple," Walter said. "I know," Eleanor said. "It never is." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "Thank you for telling me." He left. She turned back to the stove. She thought about what she'd seen in Clayton Brooks's face the previous evening. Not the surface expression, which had been blank enough, but the thing underneath it. The thing that came from a man who felt that a balance had been disturbed and was deciding what to do about it. She'd met men like Clayton before. Not the openly hostile kind, those were easier to deal with because they showed you where they stood. Clayton was the careful kind. The kind who moved at the edges and chose his moments. She decided she would watch him. She would not confront him. Not yet. She had learned that premature confrontation burned resources she might need later, and that patience, real patience, the kind built on self-possession rather than fear, was the most strategic tool available to a woman in her circumstances. She made good biscuits and waited. It didn't take long. The whispers started on Saturday. She didn't hear them directly, she rarely did. What she heard was the altered quality of silence when she entered a space where conversation had just been happening. What she noticed was the way Tommy Reed looked slightly guilty when she came through the dining room doorway that afternoon. The way Pete Garfield's eyes moved to a point over her left shoulder when she served him his coffee, instead of meeting hers the way he'd taken to doing. She served supper as if she'd noticed nothing. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove with her back to the door, and she thought with the steady, unhurried clarity that she'd built out of years of having to be clearer-headed than the situations she was handed. "Someone is talking about me, and it is not the truth they are telling." She thought about who it would be. She thought about Clayton Brooks. She thought about what she knew of him, which was not much, that he was loud and careful in a combination that made her wary, that he had a following among a small group of men who had been on the ranch longer than most, that he had not liked her from the first night, though he'd never said so where she could hear him. She also thought about the timing. Clayton's friend had been let go 3 days ago. Clayton was loyal, that much she'd observed. Loyal men with grievances were predictable in their patterns. They didn't come at you directly. They came at your reputation. What reputation could he attack? She thought about that too. She was a woman. She was large. She had appeared without much by way of documented history, and had quickly been given authority that some of the men who'd been here years didn't have. She had found the supply problem, which had resulted in a man losing his position. That was more than enough for someone like Clayton Brooks to work with. She put a second log in the stove. She did not sleep well that night, not because she was afraid, but because she was angry in the deep, low-burning way that had nothing theatrical about it. The anger of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being made to prove herself in rooms that had already decided against her before she opened her mouth, and who was tired, genuinely tired, not defeated, but tired in a way that had accumulated weight over years and didn't easily put itself down. She lay awake and looked at the ceiling and let the anger be what it was, without performing it or suppressing it, because she had learned that both of those were costly, and neither of them helped, and then she put it down at the back of her mind where she kept things that needed to wait their turn. Sunday morning, she overheard it. She wasn't meant to. She had come around the back of the barn to check whether the supply delivery she was expecting had come in through the yard, and she stopped on the other side of the barn wall when she heard her own name, because stopping when you hear your own name is a reflex that doesn't ask permission before it fires. Says the owner felt sorry for her. That's the only reason she's still here. Clayton's voice. Unhurried, conversational. He had the tone of a man sharing an obvious truth with someone who just hadn't caught up yet. A woman like that doesn't belong running any kitchen on a working ranch. Owner's soft-hearted. Figures she needed a break, and he could afford to give one. A pause. Another voice she didn't recognize said something low. The supply thing. Clayton laughed. It was a smooth sound designed to dismiss. She stumbled onto that. Right place, right time. Man made it easy to find. Doesn't make her smart, makes her lucky. Another pause. It won't last. Give it another month. She'll find it too hard, or something'll go wrong, and she'll be on a wagon back to wherever she blew in from. Women like her. Eleanor stepped around the corner of the barn. Clayton Brooks stopped mid-sentence. I was standing with 2 other ranch hands whose names she didn't know well, and all 3 of them were looking at her with the sudden arrested expression of men who had been caught, but were deciding very quickly whether to be embarrassed or to stand their ground. Clayton decided to stand his ground. Miss Whitaker, he said. His voice didn't change much. Mr. Brooks, Eleanor said. A beat. Anything I can help you with, Clayton said. He put just enough of something into the question, not quite insolence, not quite respect, to communicate that he was in control of himself. Eleanor looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at men like him, not with heat, because heat was what they expected and prepared for, but with the particular quality of attention that communicated she had heard everything and was deciding what to do with it. Not from a position of disadvantage, but from a position of perfect clarity about what he was and what this was and what it meant. No, she said. Not a thing. She walked past him toward the supply yard. She heard nothing behind her. No sound, no follow-up comment. Clayton Brooks was many things, but he was not stupid enough to say anything else while her back was to him, and he didn't know what she was going to do next, which was exactly the position Eleanor had wanted him in. She checked the supply delivery. It had come in, and it was short. Not by much, a partial sack of flour and 2 fewer tins of coffee than she'd ordered. Not dramatic, but a beginning. She noted it in her ledger, cross-referenced the delivery receipt, and drafted a note to the supplier that was polite, specific, and completely unambiguous about what she expected on the next delivery. She was back in the kitchen by 10, starting Sunday dinner, which she had decided 2 days ago was going to be the best meal she had produced since arriving. It was not a performance for the men who doubted her. It was, and she was honest with herself about this, standing at the stove with the light coming through the kitchen window and the smell of the ranch on the air outside. It was for herself. A statement to her own self made in the language she knew best, which was the language of food, prepared with total commitment and given freely. She made everything from near scratch that day. By the time the men came in for Sunday dinner, the kitchen had produced something that stopped conversation in the doorway. Tommy Reed actually said aloud, "Lord have mercy." And he was 16 and gap-toothed and from Ohio, and probably hadn't been to church in 6 months, but in that moment, he sounded completely sincere. Pete Garfield sat down and looked at his plate for a long moment, and then looked at Eleanor, who had her back to the room at the stove, and said without self-consciousness, in a voice that the whole room could hear, "Miss Whitaker, this is fine cooking." Not good, not decent, fine. From Pete Garfield, that was a proclamation. The table was different that Sunday. Eleanor felt it without turning around. The quality of the silence in the room was not the silence of men eating from obligation or from hunger. It was the silence of men genuinely absorbed in what was in front of them, which was a rare thing, and Eleanor recognized it, and she stood at the stove and felt something warm move through her chest, that she did not allow herself to name too quickly, because she had been here before and been wrong, and the fall from here was a long one. She was serving the last men when Samuel Caldwell came in. He was later than usual. She always noticed when he arrived, though she had been careful not to notice it noticeably. He came in and sat at his usual spot at the far end of the table, and accepted the plate she brought him without comment, and she was turning back toward the kitchen when he said quietly, so that only she could hear it, "You heard him this morning." Eleanor stopped. She turned. Samuel was looking at his plate, not at her. His voice had not been a question. "Yes," she said. I was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" she said. "You didn't say it." "No," he said. "But it happened on my—" He stopped. Eleanor looked at him. Something in the way he'd stopped the sentence caught her attention. "On my watch," she expected him to finish. The thing a foreman said. The thing a man responsible for a crew said. But he hadn't finished it. She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself. "It wasn't the first time someone said something like that about me," she said. "And it won't be the last." She paused. "What matters is that it's not true." Samuel looked up then, and met her eyes, and held them with the kind of directness that came from a man who did not use words carelessly. "No," he said. "It's not." She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the wash basin with the warm water running over her hands, and thought about the way he'd stopped mid-sentence. On my what? She thought about it for a long time. She did not arrive at an answer. She was not a woman who invented explanations where she didn't have evidence. But she filed the stopped sentence away with the stovepipe and the door latch and the cleared plates and the consistent, unhurried, agenda-free quality of his attention. And she thought, there is something here I don't understand yet. She was still thinking about it when Clayton Brooks came to the kitchen door that evening. She almost didn't hear the knock. It was tentative, which was not a quality she associated with Clayton, and when she turned and saw him standing in the doorway, hat in his hands, she felt the complex arithmetic of her own emotional response. Wariness, patience, and a measured willingness to hear what a man had to say before deciding what it meant. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Brooks," she said. He stood there for a moment, working the brim of his hat. He was a man, she observed, who was not comfortable with what he was doing. Whether that was because he was genuinely sorry, or because he'd calculated that this was the right move and was uncomfortable with calculation, she couldn't tell yet. "I was out of line this morning," he said. She waited. "What I said—" He stopped, started again. "It was wrong. About why you're here, about your work." He met her eyes for a moment, then looked away. "Doesn't mean I'm right with all of it. But that part was wrong, and I knew it when I said it." Eleanor looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. Clayton's jaw moved. "Because Pete Garfield told me that if I didn't, he'd make sure I regretted it. And because—" Another stop. "Because I ate dinner tonight, and I know good work when I eat it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you saying so," she said. Clayton nodded, put his hat back on his head and left. Eleanor stood in the empty kitchen and thought about Pete Garfield, who she had pegged as a man of principle beneath the gruffness, and who had apparently delivered what amounted to a direct instruction to Clayton Brooks, with enough weight behind it that Clayton had found himself standing in her kitchen doorway, making the only kind of apology he was capable of. She thought about the way communities corrected themselves sometimes when the right people applied the right pressure. She thought about what it meant that on this ranch which she had arrived at less than 2 weeks ago, someone was already applying that pressure on her behalf. She thought about Pete Garfield sitting at that table every night in his chosen chair 5 minutes early. And she thought about Samuel Caldwell saying on my and stopping. She cleaned the kitchen. She banked the fire. She went to bed. She slept well. The following week moved faster than the first one had, because Eleanor was no longer learning the shape of the place. She knew the shape of it, now knew its rhythms and its gaps and its needs, and she had stopped exploring and started building. The kitchen was under her authority in the way a kitchen needed to be meaning. She did not ask permission for what she knew needed doing. She ordered different supplies. She reorganized the storage room into a system that a blind man could have navigated. She identified which ranch hands were walking past the kitchen door at what times of day, because their schedules brought them near, and she made sure there was always something worth stopping for, not because she was performing generosity. Because she had learned in the Harmon Hotel and in the months of wandering after it, that the deepest possible purpose of a kitchen was not to feed people, but to communicate to them through the evidence of real effort and real care that somebody knew they were there. Tommy Reed brought her wildflowers on Tuesday. He carried them in his fist like he was bringing evidence to court, shoved them at her without making eye contact, and disappeared before she could respond. She put them in an old tin on the kitchen shelf. Pete Garfield saw them and said nothing, but his eyes moved to them and away with the expression of a man who had his own feelings about the gesture and was keeping them to himself. On Thursday morning, Samuel Caldwell arrived at the kitchen door before dawn. Eleanor heard him before she saw him, the characteristic quiet of his footsteps, which she had catalogued without meaning to. She didn't turn from the stove. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured him coffee. The real kind, not the punishment the ranch had been running on when she arrived, and he took it in both hands, the way people took warm things when they needed the warmth more than the drink. She went back to the biscuits. They were quiet for a time. Outside the ranch was still dark, the day not yet started the world, in the particular held breath quiet of pre-dawn. "You've changed this place," Samuel said. Eleanor didn't stop moving. The place needed changing. "Yes," he said. "It did." A pause. "More than just the kitchen." "Men eat better, they work better," Eleanor said. "Men feel like somebody gave a damn about them, they act accordingly." "Is that all it is?" Samuel said. Eleanor paused just slightly, a hesitation too small for most people to catch. What else would it be? He was quiet. She looked at him, then over her shoulder, the way she'd learned to look at him direct, but without pressure, giving him the space that he seemed to need to say the things he meant. He was looking at the tin of wildflowers on the shelf. "Tommy Reed," she said. "I know," Samuel said. He looked at her. "Miss Whitaker, I want you to know what Clayton said last week, what he said about the reason you're here." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something that had the quality of a man choosing his words with a precision that mattered to him. "That is not the truth of it." "I know it isn't," Eleanor said. "I want to make sure you know," he said, "that nobody with any authority on this ranch holds that view." Eleanor turned from the stove and looked at him fully. "Mr. Caldwell," she said slowly, "who exactly is the authority on this ranch?" Samuel met her eyes. And in the long moment that followed the kitchen quiet around them, the dark still outside the fire, steady in the stove, something moved in the air between them that Eleanor couldn't put a name to, but that sat in her chest afterward, like the beginning of a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Samuel stood up. "I'll let you get on with breakfast," he said. "Yes," she said. He walked out. Eleanor turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. She focused on the biscuits. She made them perfectly. The biscuits that morning were the best she'd made yet, And Eleanor knew it the way a craftsman knows when something has come out exactly right, not from anyone telling her, but from the feel of the work itself, the way everything had moved correctly and without hesitation, the way the kitchen had operated as an extension of her hands rather than a separate thing she was fighting with. She knew it, and she set the biscuits on the table, and she went back to the stove, and she did not think about Samuel Caldwell's question, or the way he'd looked at the tin of wildflowers, or the thing that had moved in the air between them before he'd stood up and left. She thought about it all morning. She was honest with herself about that. There was something in Samuel Caldwell that did not add up in the way that things either added up or didn't, and Eleanor had a mind that was constitutionally unsuited to leaving an equation incomplete. She had catalogued his behaviors the way she catalogued everything: the stovepipe, the door latch, the cleared plates, the pre-dawn coffee, the habit of fixing things without asking for recognition, and now the very specific and deliberate way he had looked at her that morning and said, "Nobody with any authority on this ranch holds that view. Not nobody on this ranch. Nobody with any authority." A ranch hand did not talk about authority as though it were something he was positioned to speak on behalf of. Eleanor stood at the stove and turned this over in her mind with the same methodical attention she gave to supply discrepancies. She was not a woman who leapt to conclusions. She followed evidence. And the evidence assembled honestly was beginning to point in a direction that felt strange enough that she kept checking her own reasoning, looking for the flaw in it. She couldn't find one, but she also didn't have enough to be certain, and certainty was the standard she'd set for herself before she said or did anything about anything on this ranch. She had learned the cost of being wrong too early, and she was not going to make that mistake here. So she cooked. She managed her kitchen. She watched. It was Pete Garfield who gave her the next piece of the puzzle, and he did it without knowing he was doing anything at all. It was a Wednesday, 12 days into Eleanor's time at Broken River Ranch, and Pete had come in for the afternoon coffee that had become a fixture, and he sat in his chair, the way he always sat, with the solid, settled quality of a man who had decided he was comfortable and intended to remain that way. And he said out of nowhere, in the conversational tone of a man who was continuing a discussion he'd been having inside his own head, "You know, I've been on this ranch 6 years. Eleanor poured his coffee. "That's a long time." "Long enough," Pete said. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Worked for 3 owners. 2 of them ran the place from behind a desk in the city. Never set foot in the yard if they could avoid it." He paused. "The current owner's different." Eleanor said nothing. She went to the shelf and straightened the tin of wildflowers which didn't need straightening. "Different how?" she said, keeping her voice easy. "Hands on," Pete said. "Man wants to know what this place actually is, not what it looks like on paper." He sipped his coffee. "Not many owners like that. Man's either very smart or very stubborn. Probably both." "Probably both," Eleanor agreed. Pete looked at his cup. "Good coffee," he said, which was how Pete Garfield closed a conversation. Eleanor stood at the shelf after he'd gone and felt the certainty she'd been waiting for settle into place with a quiet, decisive weight. She knew. She didn't know everything. She didn't know why or how long or what exactly he had been looking for. But she knew the shape of it, now knew it the way you know a thing when all the individual pieces finally agree with each other and stop arguing. Samuel Caldwell was not just another ranch hand. And the reason nobody with any authority on this ranch holds that view was that he was the authority. Eleanor stood in her kitchen and let the knowledge sit in her for a moment. Then she thought about the stovepipe. She thought about a man who owned a ranch crawling around her kitchen in worn boots, fixing a cracked pipe joint before she'd been there 48 hours, asking nothing for it. She thought about the cleared plates and the pre-dawn coffee and the way he watched her with that focused, unglamorous attention, as though what she was doing was genuinely worth watching. She thought about him saying, "I wanted you to judge me by my actions, not my money." Except he hadn't said that. Not yet. That was what she imagined he might say if she asked him the right question. The question was whether she was going to ask it. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, and she had not yet decided when everything changed. It started with Clayton Brooks the way she'd known it would. She had been watching for, It had registered every shift in Clayton's behavior since the Sunday evening when he'd stood in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and offered the only kind of apology he was capable of. She had assessed that apology honestly at the time, partial strategic, not without some genuine element, but fundamentally the action of a man who had been backed into a corner by Pete Garfield's considerable force of personality, rather than a man who had arrived at genuine reconsideration. She had accepted it and moved on because she was not in the business of requiring people to be more than they were, only of being accurate about what they were. What Clayton was, she had concluded, was a man with a grievance that Pete Garfield had temporarily capped, but not resolved. She was correct. It was a Thursday evening, and Eleanor had gone to the storage room after supper to update her inventory. She left the kitchen door ajar, the way she always did. She'd developed the habit of keeping airflow through the kitchen after cooking, clearing the heat and the smoke, and resetting the room for the following morning. The storage room was adjacent its own door around the back corner of the kitchen building, and she could hear through the wall the way sound carried on a working ranch when the day was winding down and the yard was quieter. She heard Clayton before she could make out words. His voice carried a particular quality she had come to identify, that specific register that men like him used when they were talking to an audience they trusted, which was a different voice than the one they used in rooms that contained people they were careful around. She stopped what she was doing. She listened. Telling you it's the ledger that's the problem. She found what she found, sure, but who's to say she didn't put some of it there herself? A pause. Another voice, low and agreeable. Think about it. Woman shows up with no documentation, no references. Anyone's checked properly gets given full authority over supplies inside 3 days. Then she finds missing inventory. Makes herself look like the honest one. Makes him look like... Clayton stopped. Chose a different word. It cleaned him out and made her look good at the same time. Convenient. Don't you think that's convenient? Eleanor stood very still. The cold that moved through her was not surprise. She had been prepared for something. But the specific shape of this, the suggestion that she had manufactured the evidence that she had framed a man to elevate herself, was a nastier piece of work than she'd quite anticipated from Clayton Brooks, and she felt it the way you feel a betrayal. You expected, not shocked, but hurt, in the particular place where hope lived, despite knowing better. She made herself stand there and finish hearing it, because she needed to know what she was dealing with. She's got the foreman's ear, the other voice said. And she's got something low and mean. Laughter. She's got Samuel's attention, Clayton said, and his voice had changed, flattened. That's what she's got. And you and I both know a man pays attention to something he stops seeing it clear. Eleanor walked out of the storage room. She did not walk toward the voices. She walked back into the kitchen, and she stood at the center of it, and she breathed. She was angry. She was angry in the way that had accumulated weight over years, and this moment was adding to it. And she understood that what she did with the anger in the next few minutes would determine a great deal about what happened on this ranch in the weeks that followed. She could go to Walter. She could go to Samuel. She could say nothing and let it burn. She stood in the kitchen and thought about who she was and what she believed and what she had decided a long time ago in a cold billing street with a week's wages and a suitcase about the kind of woman she was going to be. She had decided she was going to be the kind of woman who did not let fear choose her actions. She was going to be the kind of woman who moved toward the thing that needed facing instead of away from it. She walked out of the kitchen and around the side of the building and found Clayton Brooks and a man named Darnell Webb standing in the yard, and she walked toward them with the specific quality of movement she had developed over years of walking into rooms that weren't expecting her, deliberate, unhurried, absolutely clear in its intention. Clayton saw her first. She watched him calculate rapidly how much she had heard. She watched him decide on a position. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "I heard you, Mr. Brooks," Eleanor said. She stopped far enough away that no one could claim she was threatening, but close enough that he couldn't look somewhere else. "All of it. Don't bother deciding how much." Clayton held her gaze. He was not, she noted, as comfortable as he'd been in front of the barn 2 weeks ago. Something had shifted, whether from Pete Garfield's influence or from some reluctant private reckoning she couldn't say. But he was not the same easy, certain man he'd been. "I said what I said," he told her. Not a challenge, just acknowledgement. Yes, Eleanor agreed. You said what you said. She paused. I want to tell you something, Mr. Brooks. I did not plant anything in that ledger. I did not manufacture anything. The numbers that were wrong before I arrived, and they will continue to be wrong if anyone chooses to look at them, because numbers don't lie to protect a person's reputation. That's what makes them useful. Clayton said nothing. The man who was let go because he stole from this ranch, Eleanor continued. Not because I pointed a finger for my own benefit. I pointed at the truth. That's all I know how to do. She looked at him for a long moment. I understand that he was your friend, she said. I understand this feels like a wrong done to you. I'm not asking you to feel differently about that. I'm asking you to be accurate about what happened. She paused. If you want to come talk to me directly, you know where my kitchen is. The door is open. She turned and walked back. Darnell Webb said nothing. Start to finish. Eleanor had not looked at him once. Behind her, Clayton Brooks stood in the yard with his hat in his hands without knowing when he'd taken it off his head. And he watched Eleanor Whitaker walk back to the kitchen with the kind of attention a man pays when he has just been shown something he didn't know to expect. He didn't say anything to Darnell Webb. Darnell Webb didn't say anything either. They went to the bunkhouse separately, and the conversation that Eleanor had interrupted did not resume. What did resume, what came roaring back the very next morning, was everything else. She was at the stove before dawn, when she heard the commotion outside, boots on hard ground, moving fast, more than one pair, and voices that had the clipped, urgent quality, men dealing with something that wasn't going according to any plan. She looked out and saw 3 ranch hands crossing the yard toward the barn at a speed that was not the normal morning pace, and she saw Walter Briggs coming out of the main building with his hat barely on his head and his coat half-fastened. She stepped to the kitchen doorway. Mr. Briggs, she said. Walter glanced at her. Stay inside, Miss Whitaker. What's happened? Supply wagon, he said, still moving. Night driver. Wagon came off the ridge road about 2 miles out. Driver's on his feet, but... He stopped himself. Stay inside. He kept walking. Eleanor went back to the stove and stood there for 30 seconds. Then she packed a basket with the clean cloth she kept for burns, the tin of lard she used for pastry and had learned doubled as a treatment for rope burns and minor injuries, the good clean water she kept boiling on the back of the stove from habit, and the coffee. She picked up the basket and walked out of the kitchen. Tommy Reed was crossing the yard at a run and nearly collided with her. Miss Whitaker. Come with me, she said. Mr. Briggs said, come with me, Tommy. He came. It was 1.5 miles up the ridge road, not 2, and when they arrived, the driver was sitting against a tree with the expression of a man who had had a very bad night and was just now arriving at the assessment of how bad. The wagon was in the ditch, and 2 of the supply boxes had broken open, and the man had a gash above his ear that had bled more dramatically than it was dangerous, and a shoulder that he was holding at an angle that told Eleanor he'd wrenched it badly. She went directly to him. I'm Eleanor Whitaker, she said. I cook at Broken River. Let me see that head. The driver blinked at her. He was young, maybe 20, with a face full of mud from the ditch and eyes that weren't tracking quite right, which concerned her. I'm fine, he said reflexively, the way men did. You may well be, Eleanor said pleasantly, already lifting the cloth to his head. Let me make sure. The gash was long, but not deep. Head wounds bled, she'd learned that years ago, and the sight of it no longer made her flinch the way it had the first time. She cleaned it with the warm water and pressed the cloth steadily while she talked to him, asking him his name, and what day it was, and where he'd come from, which were the questions she'd learned told you whether a man's head was working right. His name was Charlie Drum. He knew the day. He knew where he'd come from. His eyes started tracking better within a few minutes, which she noted as a good sign. Your shoulder, she said. Wrenched it, he said, coming out of the wagon. Can you move it? He moved it slowly and made a sound that he tried to keep inside and didn't quite manage. Not broken, she said. Badly wrenched. You'll need to rest it. Charlie Drum looked at her with the muddled gratitude of someone who has been hurt, and then unexpectedly taken care of. Thank you, ma'am, he said. Don't thank me, Eleanor said. "I've got cornbread warming on the stove, and I'd like to get back to it." She stood up. Samuel Caldwell was standing 6 feet behind her. She had not heard him arrive. She did not know how long he had been there, or what he had seen, but he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the focused, assessing attention she was used to from him, but something that had been opened up by what he'd watched, something quieter and less defended than his usual manner. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "He'll be all right," she said. "Shoulder needs rest, head wounds clean." Samuel nodded slowly. "You didn't stay inside," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I didn't." A pause. "Good," he said. She picked up her basket and walked back to the ranch, and Tommy Reed trotted beside her, and behind her she could feel Samuel Caldwell's gaze on her back, with the warm, specific weight of something that was not idle attention. She focused on the road. She was still focusing very deliberately on the road. The afternoon that followed Charlie Drum's accident was quieter than Eleanor expected, the kind of quiet that follows a crisis that turned out smaller than it threatened, when energy that had been gathered for emergency disperses back into the ordinary shape of the day. The men came back from the Ridge Road in ones and twos. The supply boxes had been recovered. Walter Briggs was in his office doing the kind of administrative accounting that accidents required. Charlie Drum was in the bunkhouse with his shoulder wrapped and a plate of Eleanor's cornbread beside him, which Tommy Reed had delivered with the solemn efficiency of a boy who had decided that being useful was his function in this situation. Eleanor was in the kitchen making supper when Samuel Caldwell knocked on the open door. She turned. He stood the way he always stood in her kitchen, turned slightly sideways, not quite committed to being in the room, giving her the option of the space. She had noticed this before, and had thought it was deference, the kind of physical grammar that told you a man was aware he was in someone else's territory. Now she thought it might also be something else. "Come in," she said. He came in. He didn't sit. "I want to talk to you," he said. Eleanor put down the spoon she was holding. She turned from the stove and faced him. "All right," she said. Samuel looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had been working up to saying something, and had arrived at the point where he was going to say it regardless of how it landed. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. The word landed in the kitchen, and sat there between them, and neither of them moved for a moment. Samuel's jaw moved. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. "How long?" "A few days," Eleanor said. "Maybe a week?" "Pete," he said. "Pete didn't tell me," Eleanor said. "Pete talked. I listened. There's a difference." Samuel nodded slowly in the way of someone taking that distinction seriously, because it deserved to be taken seriously. He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor watched him find what he wanted to say, and then put it down, and find something else, and then put that down too. And she waited, because she had learned that the right words for a complicated truth were not usually the first ones, and she was willing to give him the time it took. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what part?" Eleanor said. He met her eyes. "For letting you walk onto this ranch without knowing who you were walking onto it for." Eleanor considered that. "I want to understand something," she said. "The 3 days, the terms, Walter clearing everything overnight, that was you." "Yes," Samuel said. "You were watching me," she said. "Not accusatory, just the fact of it." "I was watching everyone," he said. "I have been for 6 months, riding with my own men, doing the work, trying to see what this place actually was." He paused. "My father left me this ranch. I grew up here. And then I managed it from the city for 5 years, and it nearly ran itself into the ground without me knowing, because everything I got told was filtered through men who told me what they thought I wanted to hear." His voice had a roughness in it. Now that was new. Something genuine that hadn't been in the careful, quiet cowboy register he'd been wearing for months. "I came back to see the truth, and I needed to see it without people performing for me." Eleanor was quiet. "And when I arrived," she said slowly, "you saw a woman who did not perform," Samuel said. "Not once. Not for the foreman. Not for the men. Not for me." He paused. A woman who walked into a broken kitchen and fixed it and found what was wrong in the ledger and told the truth about it, knowing it might cost her. And then went up the ridge road this morning because a man was hurt and help was needed. Eleanor held his gaze. The kitchen was very quiet. "You could have told me," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that she couldn't fully keep out. Not anger exactly. Something more like the ache that comes from a trust that had been extended in partial ignorance. "At any point, you could have told me." "I could have," Samuel said. He didn't flinch from it. "I told myself I was waiting for the right moment." "That's partly true." He held her gaze. "The other part is that I wasn't ready. Not because I didn't trust you. Because—" He stopped. Eleanor waited. "Because once you knew," he said, "you'd look at me differently. The way everyone looks at me differently when they know. And I didn't want you to look at me differently." The kitchen held that sentence for a long moment. Eleanor understood what he was telling her. She understood it the way she understood the things that other people found difficult to say, not because she was exceptional at reading people, but because she had spent her own life living in the gap between how she was seen and what she actually was, and she knew the particular loneliness of a person who had never quite been seen right. She understood why a man in that position would want even just for a season to be known by his actions before he was known by anything else. She understood it. She was not sure yet how she felt about it. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Samuel," he said, quiet but clear. She looked at him. "Samuel," she said, "I need you to understand something about what you did." He didn't move. "Tell me." "I came to this ranch believing I was in a fair contest," Eleanor said. 3 days prove myself earned the job. That's what Walter told me. That was what I understood." She paused. "And I gave everything I had to that contest because it mattered to me. Because I needed to win it on my own terms. Because every job I've ever wanted has been about whether I could earn it without anyone handing me anything." She let that sit for a moment. "And now you're telling me that the man running that contest knew things about the game that I didn't." Samuel was very still. "Was the contest real?" she said. "Or were you always going to give me the job?" A long pause. "The contest was real," Samuel said. "I would not have kept you if you'd failed. I couldn't have, not for the ranch's sake, not for yours." He looked at her steadily. "But I also believe you could not have failed. Not you." He paused. "That's not the same thing as handing you something. It's recognizing what someone is before they've finished proving it." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She thought about the stovepipe. She thought about the door latch. She thought about a man who could have sent a carpenter, but instead showed up himself with the fitting in his hand and fixed it in 18 minutes. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who did a thing correctly, whether or not anyone important was watching. "I'm angry," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to stay angry for a while," she said. "That's fair," he said. "And I have questions," she said. "A great many of them." "Ask them," he said. "All of them. Whenever you want. I'll answer every one." Eleanor looked at him. "Not tonight," she said. "No," he agreed. "Tonight I have a supper to finish," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that was different from every other time he'd used those words. Something that wasn't deference exactly, but respect in the deeper sense, the kind that recognized the full weight of the person it was directed at. He turned to leave. "Samuel," Eleanor said. He stopped. She turned back to the stove. "Supper's in an hour," she said. "Don't be late." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Yes, ma'am." She heard him go. She stood at the stove for a long time after the door closed. Not cooking, just standing with her hands on the edge of the work table and the fire warm in front of her, and the full weight of what she now knew pressing down on the day. She had known women who would have been pleased by this revelation. She had known women who would have felt upon discovering that the quiet man with the kind hands was actually the owner of the land they stood on. A specific thrilled excitement, the kind that lived in stories told by firelight and sold in the paperback novels that came on the supply wagon from the city. Eleanor was not a woman like that. What she felt was more complicated. She felt somewhere beneath the anger and the analytical clarity she was using to hold the anger steady, a warm and stubborn recognition that the man who had fixed her stovepipe and cleared her plates and brought her coffee before dawn and said, "Good," when she hadn't stayed inside. That man was the same man who owned everything around her and had chosen to be that man consistently and without performance when he could have been any other kind. That was not nothing. That was actually a great deal. She picked up the spoon. She made supper. And when the men came in an hour later, and Samuel Caldwell came through the door and sat at the far end of the table, he looked at his plate when she set it down, and then looked up at her briefly, with an expression that contained an entire conversation's worth of things he wasn't saying. Eleanor looked back at him for exactly 1 second. Then she went back to the stove. She was still angry. But she was also quietly in the deep and honest place inside her where she kept what was actually true. She was beginning to understand that some things worth having cost exactly this: the discomfort of being seen clearly by someone before you knew they were looking, and the harder, stranger work of deciding what to do with that. She banked the fire at the end of the night. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after everyone had gone. She thought about tomorrow. She was still going to be the cook. She was still going to be Eleanor Whitaker with her suitcase and her history and her ledger and her tin of wildflowers on the shelf. Nothing about her had changed. Everything around her had. She put out the lantern and went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about a man who had wanted to be known for what he did before he was known for what he owned. She understood that. Lord help her, she understood it completely. She gave herself one night to be angry. That was the rule she had made for herself years ago, somewhere between Billings and the long road west, when she had learned that anger held too long, curdled into bitterness, and bitterness was the one thing she could not afford. One night. Feel it fully, let it have its weight, and then in the morning decide what to do with what was left. What was left when she woke before dawn on Friday and lay in the dark, listening to the Montana wind move across the flats, was something more nuanced than she expected. She was still angry. That part hadn't resolved itself overnight the way she'd half hoped it might. But the anger had clarified the way a pot of cloudy stock clarifies when you bring it to the right temperature and the impurities rise to the surface and you can skim them away and see what you actually have underneath. What she actually had underneath was this: Samuel Caldwell had deceived her by omission. He had allowed her to move through this ranch in partial ignorance of a fact that was material to her situation. That was real, and it deserved to be taken seriously, and she was not going to minimize it to make herself feel better about the things she was beginning to feel. And also, she understood why he had done it. Not just intellectually the way you understand a thing you've been given an explanation for, but in the bone-deep way that comes from recognizing in another person's history the same shape as your own. A man who had spent 5 years being told what people thought he wanted to hear. A man who had come back to his own land in borrowed anonymity because he needed to see it true. A man who had wanted even for a short season to be known by his actions rather than his inheritance. She understood that. She had spent her entire adult life wanting exactly the same thing. She got up. She built the fire. She started the biscuits. And when Samuel Caldwell's boots came across the yard before the rest of the ranch was awake, she poured him coffee without turning around and set it at the end of the work table and said, "Sit down." He sat. She worked. He drank his coffee and let the silence be what it was, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without knowing she was relying on it. After a while she said, "I want to ask you something." "Go ahead," he said. "When I found the supply discrepancies," she said, still working, "and I brought them to Walter, you already knew what I'd found before Walter told you." It wasn't a question, but he answered it like one. "Yes, and the terms, the wages, the authority, the overnight answer." She paused. "That wasn't Walter deciding." "No," Samuel said. "How long had you been watching the ledger?" she said. A pause. "Long enough to know something was wrong. Not long enough to prove it the way you did." He held his cup. "I don't have your eye for numbers. I know what's missing when I look at empty shelves. The paper trail." He shook his head. "That took someone who knew what they were looking at. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing that. Processing the specific honesty of a man admitting a limitation rather than claiming credit he hadn't earned. The man who was let go, she said. Haskell. Yes. He was stealing for months and you couldn't catch him. No, Samuel said. I knew he was. I couldn't prove it in a way that would hold up to scrutiny. He was careful. A pause. You made it hold up in one evening. Eleanor turned from the stove and looked at him. So I solved a problem you'd been sitting on for months, she said. Before you'd told me anything, before I had any reason to protect your interests. Samuel held her gaze. Yes. And that is part of why you offered me the terms you did. Part of it, he said. He put his cup down carefully. Eleanor. He had not used her first name before. He said it like he'd been thinking about whether he had the right to, and had decided he did. The terms I offered you are the terms your work earned. Not the terms I offered because you did me a service, or because I felt I owed you something, or because... He stopped, steady. The work earned it. That's the truth of it. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. She turned back to the stove. He didn't say anything else. She put the biscuits in and let the fire do its work. And outside the ranch was beginning to stir with the sounds of morning. And inside the kitchen, something between them had shifted again, not resolved, not finished, but moved to a different place than it had been. A place that had a little more air in it. When the first ranch hands started coming through for breakfast, Samuel stayed at the end of the table and ate with everyone else the way he always had, and Eleanor moved around the table, serving the way she always did, and nothing on the surface was different. But Pete Garfield looked from one to the other during the meal with the perceptive, weathered eyes of a man who had been watching people for 60 years and knew the specific quality of a room that contained two people who had reached an understanding. And he said nothing, but he poured his own second cup of coffee and took it back to his chair with the settled, satisfied air of someone whose assessment of a situation had been confirmed. Tommy Reed noticed nothing, which was appropriate because Tommy Reed was 16 and had his full attention on the biscuits. It was 2 days later that the next thing broke. Clayton Brooks came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning, and this time he came alone, and he came before anyone else was up, which told Eleanor something before he opened his mouth. Clayton had calibrated his approaches carefully throughout their time on this ranch, and an early Sunday morning visit from a man who was not an early riser was a visit that had been deliberated over. She was at the stove. She heard him at the door and said, "Come in," without turning. He came in. He stood near the door the way he had before, hat in his hands. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I need to tell you something." "Then tell it," she said. A pause. She heard him work up to it. "There are men coming to the ranch," he said. "Next week. Buyers. Or," he stopped. "Men who say they're buyers." Eleanor's hands went still for a fraction of a second, then kept moving. "What kind of buyers?" she said. "Land," Clayton said. "For the ranch. Or that's what they say they're coming for." He paused. "I heard something in town when I rode in for supplies Thursday. At the saloon. Men talking about Broken River. About how the operation here has been struggling. About how the owner..." He stopped again, choosing his words. "About how the owner might be open to an offer if the right pressure was applied." Eleanor turned from the stove. She looked at him directly. "Who were these men?" "I don't know their names," Clayton said. "I know the type." He met her eyes for the first time since he'd walked in. "I've seen the type before, Miss Whitaker. They come in before a man's operation is really failing, and they make it fail faster so the price goes down. They're not buyers. They're..." He searched for the word. "Collectors. Of things other men can't hold on to anymore." Eleanor held his gaze. "Why are you telling me?" she said. The question hung in the air. Clayton looked at his hat. "Because I've been wrong about you," he said. "It came out rough and unpolished the way true things did when a man wasn't practiced at saying them. And because whatever I think about how things should be, this ranch is still the place I've worked 6 years, and I don't want to see it taken by men like that." He looked up. "And because you're the one who should know." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Does Samuel know?" she said. Something moved across Clayton's face. "You know?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. "I don't know if he knows," Clayton said. I don't talk to him the way—" He stopped. "I came to you." "All right," Eleanor said. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." He turned to go. "Clayton," she said. He stopped. "When those men come," she said, "keep your ears open. Whatever you hear, I want to know it." He turned back and looked at her with something on his face that was the beginning of a different kind of regard than anything he'd shown her before. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left. Eleanor stood at the stove and felt the weight of what had just been handed to her settle into her chest with the particular gravity of a problem that has arrived before you were quite ready for it. She needed to talk to Samuel. She found him in the barn before the morning was half done, and she walked in and said, "I need 5 minutes." And Samuel looked at her face and said, "Take what you need." And she told him everything Clayton had said plainly and in order without editorializing. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "I've heard something similar," he said. Eleanor stared at him. "When letter came 2 weeks ago." He said it with the steady voice of a man who had been carrying something and knew it was time to put it down. "From a firm in Denver, expressing interest in acquiring ranch land in this county. Polite. Professional. I wrote back that the ranch wasn't for sale, and I didn't expect to hear from them again." He paused. "I think I was wrong about that." "Why didn't you tell Walter?" Eleanor said. "I didn't think it was a serious approach," Samuel said. "Men in Denver send letters like that the way other men tip their hats. It's reflexive, and most of the time it doesn't mean anything." His jaw was tight. "If what Clayton heard is accurate, it means something this time." "It means they know something is wrong here," Eleanor said. "Or was wrong. The supply problem, the turnover, that kind of information travels. It travels to men who look for exactly that kind of thing." She paused. "They may not know the ranch is stabilizing. They may be working from information that's weeks old." Samuel looked at her. "Which means we have a window," he said. "Possibly," Eleanor said. "If we move right." They looked at each other across the barn, and Eleanor felt under the urgency of the problem the specific quality of a partnership that had not yet been named but was already functioning, two people who were thinking about the same problem in compatible ways, who had complementary information and were processing it toward the same conclusion, who trusted each other's thinking even when the situation was pressing. It was a remarkable feeling. She filed it away to examine later. "What do you know about the state of the operation right now?" she said. "Financially." Samuel gave it to her straight, which she appreciated. The past 6 months had been costly. The supply theft had been draining the operation quietly for longer than she'd been able to document. Her accounting only went back to what was in the ledger, but the pattern suggested it had started earlier. The cattle herd was healthy, and the spring sales had been solid, but a portion of those proceeds had been earmarked for repairs that had been deferred, and the books showed a ranch that was viable but lean, without the cushion that would make an outside offer easy to refuse. "They'll offer below value," Eleanor said. "Knowing you're lean, knowing the optics of the past few months, they'll make the offer look reasonable against what they've heard, and they'll put time pressure on it." Samuel nodded. "That's how it works. And you need the ranch to look stronger than it currently does on paper," Eleanor said. "Not falsely, genuinely stronger. Which means between now and whenever these men arrive, every indicator of this operation needs to be moving in the right direction." She thought for a moment. "The kitchen accounts," she said. "I've been running them clean for 3 weeks. I can put together a comparison what the supply costs were before versus what they are now, what the waste was versus what it is. That's not a small number, Samuel. That's a real number that belongs in a conversation about the financial health of this operation." Samuel looked at her. "You'd do that," he said. "I'm already doing it," she said. "I've been keeping those accounts since my first week. I just need to format them for a different audience." A pause. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I want you in that meeting," he said. "When these men come, I want you at that table." Eleanor held his gaze. The thing that moved through her in that moment was complex. Not surprise, not exactly, but the particular sensation of being seen in a way she had learned not to expect and therefore was not prepared for when it arrived. "I'm the cook," she said. "You're the person who found my supply problem, stabilized my kitchen operation, and just told me more about the strategic situation of my ranch in 5 minutes than I've gotten from anyone in 6 months," Samuel said. "I don't care what the title is." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. She walked out of the barn and back to the kitchen and stood at the work table for a long time, with her hands flat on the surface, steadying herself against a feeling she couldn't entirely name, that was made up in equal parts of the fear of being wrong about something that mattered, and the terrifying, exhilarating certainty that she was not wrong. The week that followed was the hardest work she had done since arriving at Broken River Ranch, and she had arrived doing hard work from the first morning. She ran the kitchen without reducing a single meal. She wrote up the supply accounting in the evenings by lantern light. 3 weeks of clean numbers laid out against the 7 months of documented mismanagement, in a comparison that was, she knew, as close to irrefutable as paper could get. She reorganized the supply room a second time, implementing a system that a visitor walking through it could assess in 2 minutes as the work of a professionally managed operation, rather than the scramble of a place in difficulty. She talked to Tommy Reed about how he carried himself when men were watching the ranch, which he initially thought was an odd conversation, and then with the receptivity of a young person talking to someone they trusted, understood, and took seriously. She watched Clayton. Clayton had kept his word. He was listening in the places he could listen at the saloon on the one trip to town that Walter sent him on along the road, where men coming from other ranches sometimes stopped to rest and talk in the unofficial conversations that happened around the fire in the evenings on a working ranch. What he brought her was fragmentary and imprecise in the way that gathered information always is, but it formed a picture. 3 men, coming from Denver by way of Billings, arriving on Thursday of the following week. They had been asking questions around the county about Broken River Ranch, specifically not the general inquiry of a company casting a wide net, but the targeted research of a firm that had identified a specific acquisition and was preparing to make a move. "They know things," Clayton told her on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen door. "Things about the inside of the operation, numbers, amounts, things that shouldn't be outside the ranch." Eleanor went still. "What kind of numbers?" she said. Clayton told her. Eleanor processed what she heard and felt the particular cold clarity of a pattern snapping into focus. "Haskell," she said. Clayton's face confirmed it before he spoke. "He's in Billings," Clayton said. "I don't know that I can't prove." "You don't have to prove it," Eleanor said. "I just need to know the shape of it." She looked at Clayton steadily. "Thank you, I mean that." Clayton looked at her. "Miss Whitaker," he said with the careful deliberateness of a man making a public statement in a private conversation, "I think I've been a fool." "You've been changing," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing." He left. Eleanor went to find Samuel. She told him about Haskell. Samuel's face went very still. The particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow and deciding immediately how he was going to respond to it, rather than letting it knock him backward. "He fed them the inside information," Samuel said. "That's my belief," Eleanor said. "It explains the specificity of what they're asking around about. They're not guessing at the ranch's situation. They're working from internal numbers. Which means whatever I show them Thursday," Samuel said, "they're going to come in knowing where the weak points were." "Were," Eleanor said. "Past tense. That's the argument." She looked at him. "They're working from information that's 3 weeks old at minimum. 3 weeks ago, this ranch looked like a place in trouble. Right now, this ranch looks like a place that identified its problems and corrected them." She paused. "The question is whether we can make that case clearly enough in one meeting." Samuel looked at her. "Can we?" he said. Eleanor thought about the accounting she'd written up. She thought about the supply room reorganized and inventoried and running clean. She thought about the kitchen that had gone from a liability to the beating heart of the operation, and the men who ate in it with an expectation of being cared for, instead of just fueled, and what that did for the quality of the work they did afterward. She thought about what a ranch was at its base. Not the acreage or the cattle or the infrastructure, but the people in it, and what those people believed about whether it was worth caring about. "Yes," she said, "we can." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer me honestly." "I always answer you honestly," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm asking." He paused. These men are going to come into that meeting knowing the inside numbers of a struggling ranch. They're going to be looking for the weak points. They're going to be looking at me. He held her gaze. "And they're going to see you at that table. And they're going to decide something about what that means." Eleanor understood what he was asking. "They're going to wonder if I'm a liability," she said. "A woman at the table. A woman who doesn't fit what they expect." "Yes," Samuel said. "They are." "And you're asking me if that bothers me," Eleanor said. "I'm asking you if it changes your answer," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Samuel," she said, "every room I have ever walked into has had men in it who wondered if I was a liability. I have not yet walked out of a room smaller than when I walked in." She paused. "I am not going to start on Thursday." Something moved in Samuel's face. Something that was not quite a smile, but was the closest she'd seen from him. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." Thursday came in fast. The three men arrived mid-morning in a hired wagon from the stage road, and they were exactly the kind of men Eleanor had expected, well-dressed by city standards, with the slightly too smooth manner of people who dealt in transactions, rather than things, and the kind of confidence that came from having made this particular approach often enough to have its cadences memorized. Their representative was a man named Aldous Webb, no relation to Darnell, though the name made Clayton's jaw tighten when Eleanor mentioned it, who had silver at his temples and a practiced handshake and a voice that had learned to be reassuring across a long career of reassuring people while preparing to take something from them. Eleanor watched him come across the yard. She watched how he took in the ranch with the assessing eyes of a buyer cataloging assets, how his gaze moved to the buildings, the barn, the cattle visible in the near pasture, how he made quick mental notes and folded them away behind his easy smile. She watched him not look at her. That was the tell. A man who was genuinely surprised to see a woman at a ranch meeting looked at her. A man who had been briefed that there was a woman in the situation and had already decided how to handle her did not look at her because looking acknowledged her in a way that made his strategy harder. She filed that away. They sat at Walter's table in the office. Walter at one end, Samuel across from Webb and his two associates, Eleanor to Samuel's right, with her ledger in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, and nothing in her manner that suggested she was anything other than exactly where she was supposed to be. Webb opened. How was good at this? He acknowledged the beauty of the land, the quality of the operation, the clear commitment that had been made to the ranch over generations. He spoke of market conditions in the county, of the challenges that working ranches were facing, of the consolidation that was happening across the territory, and the opportunities that presented for men willing to make strategic decisions at the right moment. He produced a number. It was low. Not insultingly low. He was too skilled for that. It was low in the specific way that a well-researched offer was low when it was calibrated against a weakness that the offerer believed was current. Samuel looked at Eleanor. Webb followed Samuel's gaze, and for the first time he looked at Eleanor directly. Eleanor opened her ledger. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'd like to show you something." Webb looked at her with the polite, fractionally condescending attention that men like him gave to women in rooms like this. "Miss," he started. "Whitaker," she said pleasantly. "I manage the internal operations of Broken River Ranch, supply accounting, resource allocation, cost management." She turned the ledger to face him. 3 weeks ago, this operation had a supply management problem that was costing the ranch significantly. I've documented the problem and its correction here. She let him look at the numbers. What you'll see is that the operational costs over the past 3 weeks are running approximately 30% below the average of the previous 7 months. Not because we cut resources, because we stopped losing them. She met his eyes. The offer you've made is priced against a problem that no longer exists. A silence. Webb looked at the ledger. Eleanor waited. She had learned a long time ago that silence after you said the thing that needed saying was not a vacuum to be filled. Silence was the sound of information landing, and the woman who filled it preemptively was the woman who lost the argument before it had finished being made. She waited. One of Webb's associates leaned in to look at the numbers. Webb leaned back. "These are impressive," he said carefully. "They're accurate," Eleanor said. "3 weeks is a short window," he said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. 3 weeks is also how quickly an operation can turn when the right management is in place. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Webb, you've come here with information about this ranch that I believe was provided to you by a former employee. That information was accurate at the time it was gathered. It is not accurate now. Any offer built on it is respectfully built on a foundation that has already changed." Webb looked at Samuel. Samuel said nothing. He let Eleanor's words stand on their own, which was exactly right, and exactly what she needed from him. Webb looked back at Eleanor. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Not defeat, not yet. But the particular recalibration of a man who had walked into a room expecting to be the best prepared person in it, and had discovered he was not. "Miss Whitaker," he said, and this time the fractional condescension was gone. "You've clearly invested significant effort in this operation." "I've done my job," Eleanor said. "That's all." The meeting went another hour. Webb tried 3 different angles, and Eleanor answered each one not with aggression, but with the specific grounded clarity of a woman who knew every number she was discussing, because she had generated those numbers herself in the early mornings and the late evenings in the kitchen, and the supply room, and the lantern-lit corner of her small room at the back of the building. Walter Briggs sat at his end of the table and did not say much, but he watched Eleanor with the expression he'd been developing since the morning she'd walked into his office with the supply discrepancy report, which was the expression of a man whose estimate of a person had expanded past the box he'd put them in. Tommy Reed was not in the meeting, but he was outside the office because Eleanor had told him to stay nearby, and every so often she was aware of his presence on the other side of the wall. His unofficial vigil for the outcome of something he understood mattered. When the meeting ended, Webb shook Samuel's hand. He shook Walter's hand. He looked at Eleanor and said, "Miss Whitaker," with a gravity that was as close to concession as a man like him made. She said, "Safe travels, Mr. Webb." They left. The wagon cleared the yard, and Eleanor stood at the window and watched it go, and did not allow herself to feel anything too large for the space she was in. Walter said behind her, "That was something, Miss Whitaker." She turned. Samuel was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the focused, careful attention he usually gave her, and not the quiet warmth she had begun to recognize under that, but something opened up and direct, and unguarded in a way that the composed cowboy manner he wore like a second skin didn't usually allow. "You knew about Haskell before we sat down," Samuel said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you didn't tell me until this morning," he said. "You needed to walk into that room without the anger of it," Eleanor said. "Anger makes you slow." She paused. "You needed to be clear." Samuel looked at her. A long moment passed. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said, and her voice was steady. "Not right now." He understood. She could see that he understood that this was not a refusal, but a request for the right time, the right room, the right conditions for whatever was trying to be said between them. "Later then," he said. "Yes," she said. "Later." She picked up her ledger and walked out. Tommy Reed was waiting in the yard, and when he saw her face he said, "Did we win?" Eleanor looked at him. "We held our ground," she said. "That's what winning looks like." He thought about that. "Yes, ma'am," he said with the specific gravity of a 16-year-old who had just learned something he was going to keep. She walked back to the kitchen. She had supper to start, and for the first time since arriving at Broken River Ranch, she walked through that kitchen door, not as a woman proving something, but as a woman who had already proven it and knew the difference, and was quietly enormously beginning to let that mean something. The supper she made that Thursday evening was not the best meal she had ever cooked at Broken River Ranch. She knew it while she was making it. Her hands were moving correctly. The fire was The proportions were where they needed to be, but she was not fully in the kitchen the way she usually was. Part of her was still in that office, sitting across from Aldous Webb, with her ledger open, feeling the specific sustained effort of a woman who had walked into a room where she was not expected to matter, and had made herself matter anyway. And the aftermath of that effort was sitting in her chest now, like a stone she hadn't yet put down. She served the meal. The men ate. Tommy Reed told Pete Garfield something about the wagon that had come and gone, and Pete listened with the selective attention of a man who was assembling a picture from partial information and was too experienced to ask the questions that would tell him he'd assembled it right. Clayton Brooks ate quietly at his end of the table, and once when Eleanor came past him with the coffee pot, he looked up and met her eyes, and gave her a single nod that contained more in it than a paragraph of words would have. She nodded back. Samuel was not at supper. She noticed. She always noticed, and she had stopped pretending she didn't. He came to the kitchen after the table had cleared when Eleanor was at the wash basin, and the ranch was settling into its evening sounds. She heard his boots, and kept her hands in the water, and waited. "I owe you more than I know how to say," he said. Eleanor rinsed her hands and dried them and turned around. He was standing in the center of the kitchen, not at the door, not at the edge of the room, the way he'd stood 100 times before. He had moved fully into the space which he had never done before, and she noted it the way she noted everything he did, with the careful private attention she had given up trying to talk herself out of. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I did my job, Eleanor." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was saying something he'd worked out and intended to say all the way through without stopping. "What you did today was not part of any job I hired you for. You gathered intelligence. You built a strategic case. You sat across from a man who came here to take my ranch, and you dismantled his position without raising your voice once." He held her gaze. "That is not what a cook does." "It's what I do," Eleanor said. I was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." He reached into his jacket and put an envelope on the table between them. "That's the accounting for the supply savings over the past 3 weeks. Formatted the way I intend to show it to the bank in Billings when I go in next month to demonstrate the operational stability of the ranch." He paused. "I used your numbers. I want you to know I used your numbers, and I intend to tell them that." Eleanor looked at the envelope, then at him. "You're going to tell the bank that your cook put together your financial case." "I'm going to tell the bank that my operations manager put together my financial case," Samuel said. "If you'll take the title." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "We should talk about what that means," she said. "Yes," he said. "We should." He didn't move. "But I want to say something first, before we talk about terms and titles and what any of it means on paper." His voice had dropped to the register she associated with him, meaning something completely. "I want to say that I see you, Eleanor. Not what I need from you, not what you can do for this ranch, not the problem you solved, or the case you made, or the kitchen you built from nothing." He looked at her steadily. "I see you. The woman who carried a suitcase onto this ranch and stood in front of a foreman who doubted her and didn't flinch once. The woman who found what was wrong and told the truth about it, knowing it might cost her. The woman who went up that ridge road with a basket of clean cloth because a boy was hurt and help was needed." He paused. "I see that woman, and I have been trying to find the right words for what that means to me since about the 3rd day you were here." Eleanor's hands were still at her sides. She had spent years building the particular interior steadiness that let her stand in rooms that didn't want her and not let them see what it cost. She had built it the way you built any necessary thing out of what was available over time by necessity until it became genuinely hers rather than just armor. She was steady. She knew how to be steady. She was not entirely steady right now. "Samuel," she said. "I know," he said. "You're going to tell me that it's complicated." "It is complicated," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." "You're the owner of this ranch," she said. "I work here." "You do," he said. "And I'm asking you whether that's the whole story, or whether it's one fact inside a larger one." She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's fair," he said. "I need time. she said. I'm not going anywhere, he said. This is my ranch, and I'm hoping. He stopped. Let the hope stand without completing it, which was either wisdom or courage, and she thought it was probably both. Take the time you need. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it without her seeing, and he walked to the door, and he stopped. The title stands regardless, he said. Whatever you decide about everything else, operations manager, the work you've been doing deserves the name. He left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then she picked up the envelope and looked at the numbers she had already written in her own hand in the lantern-lit evenings of the past 3 weeks. Looked at them formatted on the page with the ranch's name at the top and her work visible in every row. And felt moving through the steadiness and the complication and the careful architecture of her own caution. Something she had learned not to trust, and was now for the first time in a very long time considering trusting anyway. She put the envelope down. She banked the fire. She went to bed and did not sleep for a long time, and when she finally did, she dreamed of nothing she could remember afterward. Only the feeling of open ground underfoot and enough sky above to breathe in. She woke before dawn. She lay still for a moment in the early dark and made a decision. Not about Samuel. That was not a decision that could be made in the dark before dawn, and she was not a woman who made important decisions on insufficient information. But a different decision, the one that sat underneath all the others and made them possible or impossible, depending on which way it fell. She decided she was staying, not because of Samuel, not because of the title or the terms or the envelope on the kitchen table. She was staying because Broken River Ranch had become in the weeks since she had arrived with one suitcase and no certainty of anything, a place that had made room for her. Not easily, not without friction, but genuinely in the way that mattered. She had been seen here by Pete Garfield and Tommy Reed, and eventually even by Clayton Brooks, in the specific and irreplaceable way of being seen by people who initially doubted you and changed their minds not because they were told to, but because the evidence required it. She had earned her place here. It was hers. She got up and built the fire. 3 weeks passed, and then a month, and then the summer came into Montana, with the force it always did, as though it had been waiting behind the mountain ridges, and arrived all at once, and the ranch changed the way. Ranches change in summer. Louder, longer days. The cattle herd moving differently across the pastures, the work rhythms shifting with the light. Eleanor's kitchen shifted with it. She had, by the end of the first month of summer, reorganized the supply system a third time, not because the second system was wrong, but because she had learned enough about the ranch's actual rhythms to make it more precise. She had brought in 2 additional seasonal workers for the kitchen when the crew expanded, and had trained them herself, because she was not willing to have the quality of what came out of that kitchen depend on anyone whose standards she didn't know. She had renegotiated the supply contracts, with 2 of the 3 vendors getting better terms in exchange for reliable, consistent orders, a leverage she'd identified as available and had moved on before anyone suggested she should. Walter Briggs had said when she showed him the new contracts, "Miss Whitaker, I believe you are the most efficient person on this property." "I have a good operation to protect," Eleanor said. Walter had laughed, which was not something Walter Briggs did very often, and meant something when he did. The title of operations manager had changed something. Eleanor had not expected it to change, which was not her standing with the ranch hands that had already been established, but her own relationship to the work. Having the name for the thing she was doing made the thing she was doing feel different, not larger, but more precisely itself. She had spent years doing substantial work in spaces that called it by smaller names, and the act of having the name match the work was quieter and more profound than she'd anticipated. She put it away to think about properly later. She was good at putting things away to think about properly later. She was aware, been putting Samuel away to think about properly later for 6 weeks, and that particular postponement was becoming more difficult to maintain. It was Tommy Reed who made it impossible entirely without meaning to. He came to the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in late June, and he sat on his stool with the particular quality of a young person who has something to say and is trying to decide whether they have the right to say it. Eleanor waited because she had learned that Tommy's process was worth waiting for. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You always ask before you ask," Eleanor said. "Just ask." He looked at his boots. "Are you happy here?" Eleanor turned from the shelf she was organizing. She looked at him. Tommy Reed was 17. Now his birthday had been 3 weeks ago, and Eleanor had made him a cake that had caused him to go completely speechless for what she estimated was 45 seconds, which was the most Tommy had ever been quiet in her experience. He had grown an inch since she'd arrived, and the ears were less dramatically mismatched to his face, and he carried himself with the beginning of a confidence that hadn't been there in the gap-toothed, wide-eyed boy who had told her the food smelled like his grandmother's kitchen on the first night. She had done that. She and this ranch together. She was allowed to know that. "Yes," she said. "I'm happy here." Tommy looked up. "I'm glad," he said. "Because this place it's different than it was. When I came here 8 months ago, it was..." He searched. It felt like a place that had forgotten what it was for. He looked at her. "It doesn't feel like that anymore." Eleanor held his gaze. "Tommy Reed," she said. "You are going to be all right." He grinned the gap-toothed grin that she had come to love the way you love a specific and irreplaceable thing. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe I am." He hopped off the stool and left, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen with the warm, full feeling in her chest that she had learned to identify as what happened when the work you did and the life you lived became the same thing. It was Samuel who found her that evening. She was outside behind the kitchen in the patch of ground she had claimed 2 weeks into summer with the specific purpose of doing something she'd wanted to do since her first week on the ranch. She had cleared it herself, broken the soil herself, and planted what she'd been able to get from the general store in town. Tomatoes, green beans, a row of herbs that she intended to be practical, but had ended up including lavender because she had wanted to, and she was allowed to want things. She was on her knees in the dirt checking the bean plants, and she heard him coming and did not get up. He stopped near her and looked at what she'd done. "You planted a garden," he said. "Yes," she said. "On ranch property," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll ask permission if you want me to. But I already did it, so it would be a somewhat reversed order of operations." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh, brief and genuine and rare enough that she valued it each time. "It's your property to plant on," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "That's a conversation we haven't finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands on her apron, and they stood in the evening light and looked at each other with the full weight of 6 weeks of things said carefully and things not yet said, and a great deal of shared ground between them. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you think." "Samuel." "Eleanor." She took a breath. "I came to this ranch with one suitcase and no certainty of anything," she said. "And I have built something here, with my own hands, my own mind, my own work." She paused. "That matters to me more than I can easily put into words. The fact that it's mine, that I earned it without anyone handing it to me, is the most important thing about it." "I know that," Samuel said. "I need you to know it in a way that stays," Eleanor said. "Whatever happens between us, whatever this is or becomes my place on this ranch, is not because of you. It cannot be because of you. It has to stay mine." Samuel looked at her steadily. "Eleanor," he said, "the day you walked into that kitchen and looked Walter Briggs in the eye and said, 'I know what you mean, and I'm choosing not to take offense at it,' that was the day this ranch started becoming what it should be." He paused. "What you've built here doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. That is not something I have any ability to change, and I wouldn't change it if I could." She held his gaze. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "I have opinions about how things should be done, and I express them. I've noticed." "I will not be managed or minimized," she said. "Not by circumstance, and not by a man, regardless of what that man means to me." She heard what she had just said. Samuel heard it too. The word means sat between them in the summer evening air, small and enormous at the same time. "Regardless of what that man means to me," he said very carefully, as if he was handling something fragile. Don't, Eleanor said, but she was not backing away from it. She was standing right where she was. Eleanor. His voice was quiet. I lost my wife 4 years ago. And for 4 years I have been functional, capable, getting things done and running this ranch and doing what needed doing, and I have not. He stopped, steadied. I have not wanted anything for myself in 4 years. Not until a woman arrived at my gate with one suitcase and told my foreman that hungry men deserved a real meal. He looked at her with the full force of everything he usually kept carefully contained. I want to know you. All of it. The opinions and the ledger and the garden and the way you looked at Aldous Webb when you opened your ledger and didn't give him a single inch. I want to know every part of this, and I am asking you, not offering you a position, not negotiating terms. I am asking you, Eleanor Whitaker, whether you will let me. The evening was very still. Eleanor felt what she had been holding for 6 weeks, the careful, protected space she had built around the warmest part of herself. Begin to do the thing it had been threatening to do for a long time now, which was open. She had been afraid of this. She had been afraid because she had been wrong before, about places and about people, and because the distance between where she had started and where she was standing now had been purchased at a price that she could not afford to waste. But she was also Eleanor Whitaker, and Eleanor Whitaker had decided a long time ago that she was going to move toward the things that needed facing. Yes, she said. Samuel went very still. Yes, he said. Samuel, she said. I have answered your question. Don't make me say it 3 times. He laughed then, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Eleanor felt the sound of it land in her chest, like something she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. No, ma'am, he said. I won't. They stood in the evening outside the kitchen garden, and the ranch moved around them with its familiar sounds, and Eleanor Whitaker stood on the ground she had earned and looked at the man who had seen her clearly from the beginning, and let herself deliberately, and with full knowledge of what she was doing, be glad about that. It was Pete Garfield who noticed first, because Pete Garfield noticed everything, and simply chose which observations were worth making. He noticed at breakfast the following Monday, the way Eleanor moved through the room with a quality that was different from her usual competence. Still competent. Still Eleanor. But with something underneath the competence that had room in it, that had ease in it. The ease of a woman who had put down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped knowing she was carrying it. He looked at his coffee cup and said nothing. At supper that evening, Samuel came in and sat at his usual place, and Eleanor brought the coffee around and set his cup down, and the briefest possible exchange passed between them. Not anything dramatic, not anything the room could name or report. Just 2 people in the same space who knew something about each other that hadn't been true a week ago. Pete Garfield looked at this, and then he looked at Tommy Reed, who had also noticed, and whose 17-year-old face was doing an extremely poor job of not expressing what he was feeling about it. Eat your supper, boy, Pete said. Yes, sir, Tommy said, and bent over his plate with the concentrated effort of someone using food as a substitute for commentary. The summer moved forward. The ranch moved forward with it. There was a meeting in Billings in late July at the bank, and Eleanor went with Samuel, and she sat at that table with her ledger open and her numbers clean and her manner exactly as it had been in Walter's office when Aldous Webb had arrived expecting an easy acquisition. She answered questions. She corrected an assumption. She showed the banker a careful man named Emerson, who had seen a great deal and was not easily impressed 3 weeks of evidence that the operation was stable growing and under management that knew exactly what it was doing. Emerson looked at her over the top of his papers and said, "You're the operations manager." "I am," Eleanor said. He looked at Samuel. "Smart man," he said. Samuel said, "Yes, sir, I'm aware." Eleanor did not look at Samuel when he said it, but she felt the warmth of it move through her with a steadiness that had nothing of performance in it. The terms from the bank were good. Better than Samuel had expected, and exactly what Eleanor had calculated they would be, because she had done the same analysis on his behalf that she'd done on Aldous Webb's behalf from the other side of the table, and she knew what the numbers warranted. They drove back from Billings in the wagon as the afternoon light went long over the Montana flats, and Eleanor had her ledger in her lap, And Samuel had his hands on the reins, and they talked about the ranch, about the plans for the fall, about the supply contracts, about a repair that the barn roof needed before winter. The way two people talked about a shared enterprise that they were both invested in, plainly and specifically, and without the exhausting overlay of impression management. Eleanor could not remember the last time she had talked to anyone like this. Without managing what she showed. Without the constant low-level calculation of a woman in a position that required her to justify herself at every turn. Just talking. Just two people in a wagon with the same ranch on their minds, and the same honest interest in getting it right. "You're quiet," Samuel said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About the barn roof." "No," she said. She looked at the plains opening out ahead of them. "I'm thinking about something Tommy said to me, that the ranch had forgotten what it was for." Samuel was quiet. "I was right," Eleanor said. "And I think—" She stopped finding the words for something she hadn't said out loud before. "I think that's what happens to places and to people when they spend too long without someone who genuinely cares about them. They start to run on survival. Just maintenance. Just getting through." She paused. "This ranch was doing that when I arrived, and I think—" She paused again. "What?" Samuel said. "I think I was doing that too," she said, "before I got here." The wagon moved over the road. Samuel didn't fill the silence, which was one of the specific and irreplaceable things about him. "You're not doing it anymore," he said finally. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I'm not." She looked out at the land. "Neither is the ranch," she said. He said nothing. He didn't need to. August came in hot, and the kitchen garden behind Eleanor's kitchen came in with it, the tomatoes heavy on their vines, the beans climbing the posts she'd put in with her own hands, the lavender in the corner doing exactly what lavender did in the heat, which was insist on itself with a persistence she found admirable. Tommy Reed took it upon himself, without being asked, to water the garden every morning before breakfast. Eleanor did not comment on this. She simply noticed it, and noticed that his face when he came in from doing it had a particular satisfaction on it. The satisfaction of a person taking care of something and finding that it responds. Pete Garfield, in a moment that Eleanor suspected had been building for some time, came to the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon and stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Whitaker, I owe you something." Eleanor looked up. "I doubted you," Pete said. He said it without preamble, without the hedging qualifications of a man making the minimum concession. "First week, maybe longer." He held her gaze. "I've been on ranches 50 years, and I had a fixed idea of how things worked, and you didn't fit it, and I held that against you when you hadn't done a thing to deserve it." He paused. "I was wrong, and I've known I was wrong for some time, and I should have said so before now." Eleanor looked at him. Pete Garfield was not a man who said difficult things easily. She had known that from the first night, from the quality of his silence when the food was good, from the slow and grudging nature of his approval as it had developed. She understood what this had cost him. "Pete," she said, "you cleared plates that first night, when nobody else did." He frowned. "I didn't clear plates. You ate 3 portions and didn't say one word against me," Eleanor said. "From a man like you, that was a statement." She held his gaze. "I heard it." Pete Garfield looked at her for a long moment. He cleared his throat. "Good coffee," he said, which meant the conversation was over, and everything that needed to be said had been said. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I'll pour you some." He sat. Clayton Brooks was the last piece, and he came in September before the fall. Work started changing the ranch's rhythms on a quiet Wednesday evening after supper, when the kitchen was Eleanor's alone. He knocked. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood the way. He'd stood in this kitchen multiple times before, hat in his hands working the brim, but he looked different than he had in any of those previous visits. Something had settled in him that Eleanor had been watching develop over the months since he'd brought her the warning about Webb and his associates. Some internal rearrangement that the experience of choosing correctly, maybe for the first time in a long time, had made in him. "I'm leaving the ranch," he said. Eleanor went still. "Not because of anything wrong," he said quickly. "There's an operation 2 counties over that offered me a foreman position, more responsibility, better." He stopped. It's a good opportunity. Eleanor looked at him. That's good news, Mr. Brooks, she said carefully. Clayton, he said. She nodded. Clayton. He turned his hat in his hands. I wanted to tell you before I told Walter, because he looked for the right words and found them, which she suspected cost him more than he showed. Because you were fair to me when I wasn't fair to you. And because what you did with Webb, what you did for this ranch, I was there, I heard it. And I want to say that He stopped. I'm proud that I was on the right side of it, in the end. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Clayton, she said, you warned me. You came to my kitchen and you told me what was coming when you didn't have to. You chose the ranch over your grievance. She paused. That's not nothing. That's not a small thing for a man to do. He looked at her. No, he said. I reckon it isn't. Good luck, she said. Thank you, Miss Whitaker, he said, for everything you did here. Thank you, she said, for what you did. He left, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen and felt the shape of the thing that had happened, not just with Clayton, but across all of it, across the months and the meals and the ledgers and the conversations in this kitchen that had moved people from what they were to something a little closer to what they were capable of being. She thought about the Harmon Hotel in Billings, and the owner's wife, and the week's wages, and the cold street. She thought about all the towns between that street and this kitchen. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this gate with one suitcase and stood in front of a foreman who had already decided against her and said, I know what you mean, and I'm choosing not to take offense at it. That woman had not known who she was walking onto the ranch for. Had not known that the man who would fix her stovepipe in 18 minutes was the man who owned every acre of the land she was standing on. Had not known that the 3 days she was given would become months, that the broken kitchen would become the center of something, that the place that had been running on survival would find its purpose again because she brought hers into it. She had not known any of it. She had only known what she'd always known, that she was Eleanor Whitaker, that her work was good, that her truth was hers to tell, and that the only way through any room that doubted her was straight ahead with her chin up and her hands steady and her full capability brought to bear on whatever the work required. Samuel came to the kitchen that evening as the sun went down over the Montana hills, and he stood in the doorway and looked at her with the expression that was his, and only his, the one that contained everything he didn't usually say out loud, and that she had learned over months of being looked at this way to receive without deflecting. Clayton told me, he said. I know, she said. He came in. He stood beside her at the window. You all right, he said. Yes, she said. And she was, fully, completely without qualification. She was. He put his hand over hers on the windowsill easy and unhurried the way he did everything. She turned her hand over and held his. Outside the ranch moved through its evening sounds, the cattle, the fire, the men had built in the yard. Tommy Reed's voice carrying on a laugh that she heard from here, and that meant everything was exactly as it should be. I used to think, Eleanor said, that belonging somewhere was something that happened to you, that the right place would recognize you and let you in. She paused. I waited a long time for that. Samuel was quiet beside her. And now, he said. She looked out at the garden, where the last of the tomatoes were still holding on the vines, and the lavender had gone to seed and would come back in the spring, and the ground she had broken with her own hands was resting now, waiting for what she would put into it next. Now I know it doesn't work that way, she said. You don't find belonging, you build it, with your hands and your work, and the truth you're willing to tell, and the people you're willing to show up for, even when it costs you. She paused. And when you've built it, when it's genuinely yours, no one can take it from you. Not a foreman's doubt, not a town's cruelty, not a man from Denver with a leather satchel and a rehearsed smile. Samuel's hand tightened slightly around hers. Eleanor Whitaker looked out at Broken River Ranch, her kitchen, her garden, her numbers in the ledger, her people at the fire, her ground under the Montana sky, and felt the full, unguarded weight of a woman who had finally completely arrived. She had not been saved by this place. She had not been rescued by the man standing beside her. She had walked through every door that needed walking through, told every truth that needed telling, and built with her own hands the life that had always been waiting for her. Not somewhere she hadn't reached yet, but inside the work itself, inside the showing up, inside the choosing every single day to be exactly and entirely who she was. Eleanor Whitaker had always been enough. She had simply needed a kitchen of her own to prove it to herself once and for all, in a way that would never again require another person's permission to be true.